good news. We call it the gospel, right? As Christians, we continue to learn about what it means to be obedient to God. We continue to learn what it means to follow God's commands. But another thing that we need to keep in mind that we should be doing is also preaching the gospel. Time and time again, all of us here would have heard from many Christians, many pastors saying we need to preach the gospel. We need to tell people about this great news of Jesus. And although all of us know that we need to preach the gospel, not many of us might know what that actually looks like. And so today, we are going to be taking a look at the topic on how to practically preach the gospel. Or in other words, how to practically tell people, show people this good news that we ourselves also experienced. Just like any good news, you can't just keep it to yourself. Whenever you receive good news, you wanted to share it with people, right? Even actually before we were playing board games, Joe bought a very splendid board game called Splendor. And I'm not trying to brag or anything, but I won. And the reason why I'm sharing this is because after I won, this was great news to me. I couldn't contain it. So I kept telling Johanna, I kept telling Amy, I won, because it's great news. And now that's a very small good news, right? The greater the news, the more we want to share it. And this news that Jesus Christ died on the cross for our sins is the greatest news of all newses. So, what does that mean? We should be telling people about this great news. So today, let us learn from Jesus Christ himself on how we can tell people about this good news. Is that cool with you guys? So with that being said, let us open up to our Mark chapter 2. Mark chapter 2. And we're going to read from verse 13 to 17. Let's read. Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him, and he began to teach them. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him, and Levi got up and followed him. Now, while Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, but there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And so on hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Mark chapter 2, verse 13 to 17. How to practically preach the gospel. So, the first thing that we learn from today's passage is that we need to take the initiative. We need to take the initiative. That's the first thing that we learn about. How to preach the gospel, you need to take the initiative. We take this from verses 13 to 14. So, as you guys look at the beginning of chapter 2, we see like a subtitle that says, Jesus forgives and heals a paralyzed man. And that essentially is what happened in the previous passage. Jesus forgave and healed a paralyzed man. And as a result, many people started following him because it's cool. Like, this guy healed the sick person. And so, Jesus, after healing this man, was walking beside a lake with a large crowd following him. What was that? Okay, and while he was walking, he saw at a distance a person called Levi. And he was sitting at a tax collector's booth, which basically is supposed to show that he's a tax collector. So he was a tax collector. So Jesus, he went up to Levi and he said, "Follow me." Now, although the gospel author Mark does not actually write any more than this little detail of "follow me," Levi would have at least have heard of the good news from other people, or heard of Jesus, or Jesus might have explained further about what the good news was. We don't know, but the point is that Levi would have experienced some form of the good news, which is why after Levi heard from Jesus, "Follow me," he chose to follow him. Now, although that the passage does not show this as well, there would have been an extreme amount of confusion between Jesus' disciples and the crowd. Because keep in mind, the crowd were probably like 98% Jews. Now, one thing about Jews and tax collectors were that many Jews did not like tax collectors. Okay? Tax collectors were primarily Jewish people as well. But the reason why many Jews did not like these tax collectors, two reasons. First of all, was because they worked under the Roman Empire. So they were taking tax from the Jewish people and giving it to the Roman Empire. And obviously the Jews wouldn't like this because at this time, the Roman Empire was the nation that was ruling over Israel, ruling over the Jewish people. So they did not like it. They're like, wow, you are such a traitor to betray us and take the money and give it to the Roman Empire. The second reason why tax collectors were so hated by the Jews was because oftentimes tax collectors took more money than was required. As a result, the Jews did not like tax collectors. The Jews hated tax collectors, and the tax collectors in Jesus' day were seen as major social outcasts. Nobody liked them. But what did Jesus do? Jesus did not judge or criticize him, but simply he invited Levi to come follow him. And the reason why this is crazy is because Jesus at this point in time was known as a Jewish rabbi, someone who was a bit higher than tax collectors in the social standing. And so it would have been absurd for a Jewish rabbi to go to a tax collector and say, hey, join me. No one would have done that in Jesus' day. But Jesus did so because he did not judge or criticize Levi because he was a tax collector. Now, what's important to note in this interaction, who was the one who approaches the other person first? It's Jesus. Jesus approached Levi first. And you have to understand, it doesn't work the other way around. It would have been impossible for Levi, the tax collector, someone of such low social standing, to approach Jesus, a Jewish rabbi. That just wouldn't happen. It was the other way around. Jesus himself was the one who went to Levi. He initiated this conversation. He initiated this relationship with Levi. It was Jesus who was the one who initiated the good news to Levi. There's this book called Follow Me, which is quite fitting for today's passage. A book called Follow Me by a famous author called David Platt. Now, David Platt, in this book Follow Me, he gives really good illustrations that are very related to this point that I'm trying to get across. For example, at a hospital, you guys know patients, how they're connected to this machine and they have what's it called? Like a machine that shows your heart rate, like a tick, tick, tick. And usually when it goes tick, it means they're gone, right? So at a hospital, right, if a patient's heart rate flatlines, they're dead, right? A dead patient is not the one who tells the doctor, hey, doctor, can you resuscitate me? It's not that way. It's the other way around. The doctor is the one who chooses to initiate reviving this man through resuscitation. On the other hand, for example, orphanage, right? A child at an orphanage is not the one who decides to be adopted into a family. It's the other way around. It is a couple who chooses to adopt a child from the orphanage, and then the child comes out. It's not child chooses parent, it's parent chooses child. The parents are the ones, the couple are the ones who take the initiative to adopt the child. And so likewise, it is not the non-believers who initiate hearing the good news from us. It's the other way around. We are the ones who should be going to them and telling them about the good news. We need to initiate telling people and showing people the gospel. In order for the gospel to be heard, it must be preached. In order for the gospel to be preached, there must be someone who is doing the preaching. And as I mentioned before, it would have been impossible for Levi to approach Jesus first. It's the other way around because of his social status as a tax collector. And so therefore, Jesus had to be the one who initiated it. And so likewise as Christians today, we too have the responsibility, like Jesus, to go out into this world and tell and show people the good news. It's not the other way around. We are the ones who initiate. We are the ones who go out and tell people and show people Jesus. What does this look like? How do we actually do this? It could be something as, talking to your non-Christian friend and telling them everything you know about Jesus. It could be that, right? But it could also just be something as simple as inviting your friend to church. It could be inviting someone to cell group. It could be inviting someone to a church event. Or it could simply be you as a Christian living as a Christian. Regardless of the method, the point is this. If we don't go out to the world and initiate telling and showing people the good news of Jesus, how will anyone hear it or see it or experience it? They cannot. And therefore, we are the ones who should be going out into the world and telling people, showing people the good news. Now, of course, we do say that God is sovereign, which is basically a fancy way of saying God is in control. Why do we need to do anything if God is in control? Well, it's because although God definitely can save people without us, he deliberately chooses to use us to do his work. And so therefore, if we want God's work to be done, let us be obedient and actually go out and tell people the good news. Because when we do so, we are allowing God's work to be done as well. God chooses to use us to do his work. Therefore, let us do our part so that he can do his. And again, just as how Jesus was the one who came down to us to save us, right? It's not the other way around. We didn't choose to be saved. He came down to us to save us. Therefore, we too must go out to the world and tell people about Jesus so that they too may experience the good news that we have as well. The first point is we need to take the initiative. We can't just be lazy Christians and just live a good Christian life and expect people to be saved. We have to take the initiative and go out and tell people about Jesus. So that's the first point. The first practical point about proclaiming the good news is that we need to take the initiative. Okay, great. The second point that we learned from today's passage is that we need to live gospel-centered lives. We need to live gospel-centered lives. That's the second step of telling people about Jesus. We take this from verses 15 to 17. So after inviting Levi to follow me, Jesus, Levi invites Jesus and says, "Hey Jesus, would you like to come to our place to eat dinner?" And Jesus accepts this invitation. And at Levi's place, there was obviously Levi and Jesus' disciples, but also other tax collectors and sinners. A place full of people who were considered sinful by the religious authorities of the day. Now, inviting someone to eat at your place for dinner and actually going to someone's place to eat was way more significant than it is today. I know today, we like to invite our friends to come over to eat dinner or not. It's not that significant. But in Jesus' day, it was very, very significant. You as the host, if you invite someone, you are making a promise to protect this person that you're going to invite and take care of him or her. On the other hand, if you're in the position of receiving an invitation, if you choose to accept the invitation, you are basically saying, I am making a promise to become a close friend of yours. So it was a very intimate thing to go to someone's house to eat. And keep in mind, Jesus didn't go to a priest's house to eat. Jesus didn't go to a very well-known religious teacher or leader. But he chose to accept the invitation of a tax collector to eat dinner with other tax collectors and other sinners. And so what's clear was that this dinner was not just any ordinary dinner, was it? But it was a dinner that celebrated the Jesus movement, that God loved and desired to have a relationship with sinners. It was a great kind of dinner. And so when the Pharisees, who were the religious teachers of Jesus' day, when they saw all this happening, they were, to be honest, rightfully confused. Because in their mind, right, this is how the Pharisees think, right? If Jesus says that he's a teacher from God, if Jesus says he's a man from God, he should not be interacting, let alone eating, with people like tax collectors and sinners, because that would make him religiously unclean. That would make him unholy, and that would make him unsuitable to serve God. And so that's how the Pharisees were thinking, which is why they asked Jesus' disciples, hey, why does your teacher eat with sinners and tax collectors? And so Jesus, hearing this, responded. He uses some sarcasm to essentially say, you Pharisees, you guys are self-righteous people. You think you are so holy, you think you are so good, and therefore you will never experience the good news. But these sinners and tax collectors, these people who acknowledge that they are broken, who acknowledge that they are weak, who acknowledge that they are in need of God, I have come so that they may receive salvation. That's what Jesus' response is when Jesus says, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. And the main takeaway from this section is that Jesus, hear this out, Jesus did not merely tell Levi about the good news and leave him, did he? What did he do? After he told Levi about the good news by saying, follow me, he ate dinner with him and his fellow tax collector friends and sinners. Or in other words, Jesus did not just tell Levi about the good news, but he actually followed through and showed the gospel through his life. Jesus lived a gospel-centered life, and in doing so, continued to show the good news to Levi, to tax collectors, and the sinners. Have a think about this. You guys have friends? You guys are lucky, because I don't have many friends. Because you guys are my family, okay? Okay, the difference between a good friend and a bad friend is the way that they interact with you. Yeah, we can agree with that, right? Yeah? Think of this. An ingenuine friend, if that's even a word, is someone who will continue to talk over you, talk about themselves. They don't care about you. They just want you to know about themselves. And I can speak from experience because I love doing that. On the other hand, a genuine friend is someone who actually cares for you, rarely talks over you, and is always willing to listen to you. Right? You guys have friends like that? Yeah, those are genuine friends who deeply care for you, who actually listen to you. So likewise, when a Christian just merely tells people about the contents of the gospel, Jesus died on the cross and now you're forgiven, and after that just walks away, how do you think that person is going to think about the good news? They're going to be like, okay, that's quite ingenuine, that's quite fake, Yeah, you can say all these facts, but I don't really feel it. I don't really experience it. And so usually when people do this, when Christians just tell people about Jesus and that's all there is to it, many, many times the reaction is, I don't care. I don't care. But on the other hand, when a Christian willingly listens, cares, and takes care of others, by doing so showing a gospel-centered life, when that Christian starts talking about Jesus, more often than not, people want to listen. Because they believe that what that Christian has to say actually has power. What that Christian actually has to say has merit. So the point is this. We shouldn't just merely tell people about Jesus. If you do, that's not preaching the gospel. We need to tell people about Jesus, yes, but we also need to live a life that accurately reflects that. If we do not live gospel-centered lives, don't bother telling people about Jesus. So get that right first. Because only when you can live a gospel-centered life can people truly experience the power of the gospel. So, like I said, what many Christians get wrong today is that they try to preach the gospel just through their mouths. and only telling people about Jesus and thinking that they're all there is to it. But as we see from today's example from the book of Mark, the way that Jesus preaches the gospel is completely different to how many Christians do so today. Jesus did not merely tell Levi about the gospel, but he shared the gospel by his willingness to eat with other tax collectors and sinners. By doing so, he showed a tremendous amount of love and care and compassion and kindness to a group of people who were hated and ostracized by society. By actually caring for these people and loving these people, he was able to present the gospel. Because through his interaction with them, he was showing them, I will die for you so that you may have a relationship with God. And what's even more interesting was that Jesus, in the passage, doesn't say to the tax collectors and sinners, you guys are wrong, you guys are sinful, I'm right, I'm righteous, you're wrong. He doesn't do any of that. And of course, there will be times where we do need to argue and debate about the good news. But that should never be the core reason or the core of our preaching. Telling people about Jesus, preaching the gospel, isn't trying to beat other people in debates and arguments. That's not what preaching the gospel is. But as Jesus shows, preaching the gospel is the willingness to show the gospel by living lives like Jesus, lives of love. So, we are not to merely share the gospel by telling people about facts about Christianity, but rather we need to share the gospel by actually living gospel-centered lives. So what does it look like though? What does it look like for Christians to live gospel-centered lives? Basically everything we've learned this year, but if I want to be more practical, I'll show you guys. It looks like this. Not only thinking about how can I get him or her to become a Christian? What arguments can I use in my head to make this person a Christian? But instead, actually caring for that person and loving that person. It could look like maintaining friendships with your non-Christian friends, listening and caring to their struggles, and continuing to grow in your friendship with them. And when appropriate and opportunity allows, then go ahead. Tell them about Jesus and how Jesus has impacted your lives. It could look like not being so obsessed with winning or losing arguments. Because at the end of the day, what saves people? What saves souls? It's not an argument. It's not winning. Winning arguments don't save souls. Jesus Christ does. And therefore, our main priority then should be showing people Jesus Christ through the way that we live. What we're trying to do is we are trying to show the love of God. That is how we should prioritize preaching the gospel. By the way that we treat others, talk to others, listen to others, and care for others. Just as how Jesus loved, cared, and showed kindness to tax collectors and sinners, who only, in the society standards, deserved hatred. If simply telling people about Jesus was all there was to preaching the gospel, you know what that means? It would mean then that rallies, revivals, conferences, evangelistic events, street preachers, it would mean that these ways would be the most powerful forms of evangelism. But are they? They're not. They're clearly not. They don't work. Okay, they could work, but usually they don't work. Who knows what God can do, right? But all we know, and as we know, is that usually these methods aren't effective. Like every time I go outside and I see like a street preacher, and I hear what them say, I'm like, oh yeah, I agree, but nobody is listening to them. Why? Because no one cares. People don't care because they aren't being cared for. And so as Christians, we too must care for them if we expect for them to care for us. Now, of course, there are such cases in the book of Acts where Peter preaches and many, many people come to believe in Jesus. But keep in mind, that context is within the context of the Christians living as faithful disciples. They are constantly taking care of the poor, constantly showing kindness and generosity to their enemies. And within that context, when Peter preaches, people are saved. And as you see throughout the rest of history, we see the history of the church, right? The most common and most effective form of evangelism, guess what it was? It was through the use of common man and woman. It was not through great preachers. It was not preachers who saved people or who led people to be saved. It was through the common man or woman. The common man and common woman living gospel-centered lives, showing the gospel to their friends, family members, co-workers, slaves, slave masters by living gospel-centered lives, taking care of the poor, healing the sick, and also being executed for their faith. At its core, it was the way that they lived that witnessed Jesus Christ to the world. So I'm not saying don't tell people verbally about Jesus. But what I'm saying is you can't just expect people to believe in Jesus if you just tell them and you don't live by it. We must tell people about Jesus, but we must also show people Jesus through the way that we live. Is it easy though? No. It's so hard. It's so difficult to actually live gospel-centered lives. But even though it is hard, we still do it. And the reason for that is because God gave us his very best. We all deserved punishment because of our rebellion against God. But God did not give up on us, but he continued to pursue us, ultimately giving us Jesus Christ, who would go on to take the punishment that we deserved so that we can have a relationship with him. God did not just simply unleash a bunch of words and facts to humanity. But what did he do? God himself came down to us. He interacted with us. He had a relationship with us. He loved us. He was living among us. God showed the good news to his people through relationship. Jesus' relationship with us. And so therefore, the proper way to respond to this extraordinary love, this tremendous amount of love, is to go out and extend that same kind of love as well. Yes, go ahead. Preach the gospel verbally. Tell your friends about Jesus verbally. That's great. But make sure that you are living lives that is also preaching the gospel. So today, as we leave, throughout this week, think and pray. Who does God want me to speak to? Who does God want me to preach to? Could be an individual, could be a group of people. Regardless, we need to ask God and pray. Pray and ask. And then in obedience, let us show them the gospel. If you have the opportunity, go ahead. Tell people about how Jesus died on the cross for our sins. But if you don't, make sure that you are living in a way that is so holy and different and full of radical love, so that when people see you, they would ask why. Preach the gospel verbally and display it physically. That is how we should preach the good news of Jesus Christ. Let's pray.